Welcome to Transformational Blueprints, the podcast that's here to tackle the big question. Why do so many transformation programs fall short, and what can we do about it? I'm Mario Michaels, founder and director of Synaxia Group, and I'm thrilled to have you join me. In this series, we go beyond theory, bringing you first-hand stories and insights from some of the world's top architecture and transformation leaders. It's all about sharing real-world lessons, sparking fresh ideas, and giving back to the architecture community. So whether you're looking to learn, be inspired, or stay ahead of the curve, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive in together. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Whether you're tuning in from your desk, your kitchen, or somewhere in between meetings, we're really thrilled to have you on here. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, and if so, welcome back to the surface, you'll probably know our guest speaker today, Grant Ecker, VP of Enterprise Architecture at Ecolab, and a lot of other things on top of that as well. But just in case you didn't, we'll start with a quick intro to his incredible career journey, because before we dive into the core topics, it's worth knowing the context and why his voice matters in the conversation around EA. Today's session is all about bringing architecture out of the shadows and into the boardroom. Too often, and we all know this, architecture is seen as a foundational but invisible until something breaks or the business tries to scale and it hits a wall. We're going to tackle that head on today. So we're going to explore three critical areas. Firstly, providing value to the business. So how to communicate architecture wins in ways that resonate with non-technology and commercial stakeholders. Adapting to emerging tech, especially AI, it's on everybody's lips at the moment. So how to cut through the hype and make responsible, scalable decisions. And finally, to do all that, you need to tackle the talent and skills gap, which inevitably there is, including how to grow the internal capability and what the future of an EA practice actually looks like. So we've got some big questions, so no doubt some bold opinions, and most importantly, plenty of practical takeaways. So let's jump in. First things first, for those of you who haven't had the great pleasure yet, Grant, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your career to date, please?
Sure thing. So I'm a bit of a career enterprise architect, chief architect. I started my career at General Mills, where I grew up in the technical ranks. And then I pivoted over to Lowe's Home Improvement, where I spent a brief time in collaboration in HR before from HR, I kind of finally found my way into the EA function and started a rinse and repeat process of taking reactive and central large program focused architecture practices into federated and enterprise-wide practices that try to engage architects across the company. So started that with Lowe's, then moved to Medtronic, where I was their director of architecture for the US and ran the global process, and was then promoted to their chief architect. Pivoted over to Walgreens Boots Alliance, where I helped to unify the architecture practice across the US Walgreens business and the UK Boots business and a few other parts of that larger organization. I also joined Danaher as their global chief architect, looking at consolidating their architecture across different inorganically acquired businesses, and helped with rolling out their AI strategy and some of the initial work in that space. And most recently, and today, I'm very proud to be the global chief architect at Ecolab. Across that journey, I started a nonprofit called the Chief Architect Network. This is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that brings together architect practice leaders like myself across the globe. Today, we have 490 members globally. We just had a big event in London in April. We're getting ready for a similar event in Dallas, September 24th to 26th. So if you're a global chief architect or leading a practice of 10 or more, join us at chiefarchitectnetwork.com. No cost, and it's a great way to engage your peers in conversations like these.
And as someone that's attended the London dinner, firstly, the caliber of architects in that room is the best I've ever been in. And secondly, the conversations were just out of this world. There's people from all over the world that travel to London. So I think that says a lot about the quality of the group and the quality of the event as well. So certainly won't be any wasted time. So as we go on through this session, if you have any questions, don't wait for a break in the session. Just get them asked and we'll try and answer them as we go along. So we're going to start off, Grant, with proving value to the business. So architecture by its nature is, as I mentioned earlier, foundational. It's often invisible until something breaks or until business tries to scale and it hits friction. That makes it really difficult for enterprise architects to, suppose, quantify their impact in commercial terms. And in a world where stakeholders want to see, revenue outcomes or customer improvements or cost savings, not abstract models or PowerPoints or reference architectures. So I suppose if we start with why is it so difficult for architects, and not just enterprise architects, architects in general, to prove their value in commercial terms?
I think it really stems back to the fact that well architected solutions are pretty silent. They're not noisy with a lot of issues. They scale, they grow. So I kind of take it as a similar metaphor to somebody who needs medication to stabilize their mood. Very normal condition. Mental health is really an important thing. Well, I kind of think of it the same way in terms of an organization. The mood stabilizer is ensuring you have a solid architecture. And when you don't, you start to see the opposite things happen where instability shows up and some of the challenges. So I think that's kind of the challenge is and the same thing that happens with the medical system in that space is you start to think you're okay. You start to think, "Hey, I can do this and I don't need all that architecture or all that sort of upfront work. Everything we've got's going fine." And it will. That's the funny thing. When you take see organizations that take out their architecture function, it's usually a 6 to 12-month delay before they start to see the impacts from that decision. So that's why it's so important for architects to try to tie their value back to the business outcomes they're driving
Hmm.
around interconnected systems, around supporting business transformation, around supporting some of the things that are changing, and also looking at some of the goals that are across the CIOs and the business teams to landscape, which isn't the same in all environments. You might
Hmm.
be looking to get cost out in your back office systems and looking to innovate on your customer facing systems. So you don't want to start doing an application rationalization program on the customer facing systems. You want to experiment and try out what's best of breed. Meanwhile, you might fund that by harmonizing and consolidating things that are behind the scenes and back end. So
Hmm.
being able to tie how you're kind of bringing recommendations and architecture forward in terms of what those business outcomes are is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's aligning the architects to the initiatives, I suppose, isn't it? As you mentioned a couple there. So how can architects actually better align, sorry, their initiatives with measurable business outcomes and objectives like revenue growth, like cost savings, like customer experience?
Well, a friend of mine, Pat Salaski, and I kind of came up with this Gartner case called interconnected business capabilities. And what
Okay.
that really does is it helps articulate from that business imperative of maybe it's grow market share. You might say, well,
Mhm.
what are the key capabilities that are going to help us grow market share?
Yeah.
So we might say one of the big ones is product and service innovation. And connected with that are several other things that might not be as obvious, but are absolutely critical, like key opinion leader engagement. If the key
Hmm.
opinion leaders don't see your product and service innovation as something that adds value, no one might be aware of it. The same thing might be true with email campaign management. So
Hmm.
you start to draw these primary and secondary capabilities out on paper, and then you start to look at how mature are you in each of these. And you can look at it from the four lenses we commonly use people, process, information, and technology, as well as KPIs, right? We're going
Yeah.
to look at those as well. How are we measuring that today? Now we're going to do that last step of asking the actual people closest to delivering that service or that capability for our business how mature they are today and what
Hmm.
they think they need to be able to achieve that gap in what we need in our capability enablement to drive that outcome for each area. So now you're not the parents looking at a mobile that's kind of staring at us. It's actually looking at the baby. You might have
Yeah.
seen that meme on the internet. And I think that's what's so important is we get it in the voice of the people delivering the service. And now we actually understand what our people think they need to close that gap. We have a holistic view of the change needed to drive our maturity who achieve those outcomes. And we
Hmm.
can also track our journey in terms of a Gantt chart of the people, process, information, and the measures that are going to help us get there over time.
And I suppose one of the common pitfalls is around that communication piece, isn't it? Of everything you've mentioned there, I think what some architects, actually most architects, don't do very well is communicate in plain old English. So
Mhm.
they get wrapped up in this, reference architecture, or this terminology that architects use and technologists use. But actually, what you're doing is you're trying to influence somebody who doesn't come from a technology background. So as you said there around email marketing, well, use marketing language, and that's your job as an architect to do that because it's part of human psychology, right? If you want to influence someone, you've got to talk their language. And you often see that a lot of times where architects don't, and they speak really technological terminology, and they just lose the audience, and then they get really frustrated. And you've given a really good example there around the really effective way to get that communicated. When trying to secure investment in architecture tooling or headcount, because again, headcount's a massive one from my perspective, from a talent perspective. Businesses believe, oh, we don't need more than one architect. Surely one architect's enough, and so on and so forth. So when you're trying to secure that investment, what does a strong business case look like?
Well, I think really I make the business make that case. So what I will do is I'll take the architects that we have in our organization, I'll align them to the most critical, most impactful using a measure we call architecture significance, which
Hmm.
is either the risk or the impact that a particular technology or landscape change will make. And we
Hmm.
invest to the right level of rigor for something that's on the high end of that scale. We might put together a pretty robust both solution selection and then ultimately that overall architecture of how that's going to come to bear in our organization.
Hmm.
And for things that are a little bit less critical on that gradient scale, we might just simply look at a key decision document to understand what are the different trade-offs that we could, what are the different options and what are the trade-offs of each solution and what we recommend. So effectively, when you get a more critical imperative on your desk, you take the less critical imperative and you start to deprioritize, and it
Yep.
bar continues to rise. So effectively, there's a point you reach at which you have set the bar at what you can staff, and anything below that, you have to kind of let the math work itself out. So
Yeah.
generally, it's the business demand for incremental architecture support for something that isn't at that bar,
Hmm.
given where we are staffed today. And that's where you have now an automatic partner to support you in the business case to add more people. As architect leaders, I actually don't care how many people work for me. I will
Yep.
invest the people I'm given to achieve the best outcomes possible for the organization I support and be okay with the fact that things beyond the capacity of what my team can do will be addressed by to the best of the ability of my peers in the organization. When that's not sufficient, I'll either ask them to support me in a headcount case to help them achieve their outcomes, or I'll train their people and try to
Hmm.
build a federated architecture contingency in their organization, either contract or full time. And I
Hmm.
think that that is ultimately whichever mix works better in that organization is fine. The key
Yeah.
is making sure we're supporting outcomes, and getting a big central bloated team is usually more of a headache than a help because everyone wonders, what's that big team doing and why am I not getting enough value from them? So honestly, I lean into that federating approach of having the architects join in those functions,
Hmm.
especially when the outcome is very specific to one or two areas. But you do need enough scale at the middle to look at the organization holistically and make sure that you have the bandwidth to connect the dots across the different teams.
Hmm. And just to slightly touch on that point you made around having some organizations choose to have a big team, and everyone sort of has this perception of what do EA actually do. It's seen as a back office function. Where has that stigma come from, Grant, as somebody that's been in the industry, pretty long time?
Well, I mean, it's kind of how we start. I created this kind of geeky thing I call the Ecker hierarchy of architecture.
Yeah.
And it's a play on Maslow, where you
Yeah.
start with the foundations, right, of safety, and then you start to build up into some of that emotional components
Mhm.
of belonging, and then eventually you can find your self-actualization. Well, it's the same with architecture. We start because things do blow up. I talked earlier as we opened the conversation around what happens when there isn't architecture. Things aren't scalable, problems are seen, especially in the enterprise picture. So that
Mhm.
generally creates the CIO mandate to start to close that gap with EAs getting engaged in things that are breaking, to that providing value, to EAs being engaged in everything
Mhm.
of significance in the pipeline. And now at that point, you are a back office function that's helping to connect the dots across projects. That's why people see us that way. So it's actually as we start to grow up that hierarchy that we start to change that perception. Once we do enough execution and delivery and we're trusted, we get
Mhm.
invited to strategy, right? And
Yeah.
we actually start to bring those conversations forward. And rather than people going, oh, you're just another person with an opinion, they get
Mhm.
curious because they've seen our outcomes. And as
Yeah.
we start to do that work consistently, we can change the brand to being a back office function and really transform when we get to the top of the pyramid, the self actualization of architecture, which is innovation. This
Yeah.
isn't just using the latest nifty tech that's out there. Today, that would be AI. It's actually about supporting the company holistically and thinking differently about how we perform our business. Where do we need
Mhm.
business model innovation? Where do we
Yeah.
need process innovation? Where do we need to look at how we're structured and shift that to support different outcomes? How do we go to market in a different way? And
Mhm.
then, sure, how does the technology, how does the data help us achieve those things?
Mhm. Okay. Fair enough. We're going to round up that section now. So I suppose a couple of sort of things to take away. So if you're in an environment where you're struggling to justify investment in architecture tooling or headcount, or if there's pushback from the business units who don't understand why standards and guardrails are needed, if you're in a buy versus build and you're asking the question why, or modernization or digital transformation, proving value to the business of what architecture can do is absolutely imperative. So Grant mentioned earlier tying your initiatives to KPIs. So whether that's improving time to
Mhm.
market, reducing system downtime, enabling new digital services, make sure you're tracking absolutely everything. Showcasing wins in plain English, as I said, depending on the department that you're speaking with, and then building business cases with clear sort of either cost avoidance or ROI models will certainly help with your business case. So we're going to move on to adapting to emerging tech. Now, Grant, obviously, the rate of technological change has never been faster. I did a podcast with a chap called Gerber Vida, who talks about the complexity crunch, and that's just on the ever increasing. So EAs are now expected to be fluent in everything from generative AI to LLM deployment models, edge computing, quantum risk, and then all your cloud architecture and so on top of the existing stack. But it's not just about understanding the tech, it's about determining when, how, and if to adopt it in a responsible manner across the whole of the enterprise, or whether it's in little pockets. You can't just throw AI into the mix and hope it sticks, I suppose. So, with so many emerging technologies from LLM, sorry, to edge computing, how do you decide what's hype versus what's strategically important?
Well, I don't try to do it alone. That's the first thing, right? Like the most important thing we need to do is surround ourselves with people that know more about the tech than we do.
Yeah.
Whether that's internally, people that spend, 40 hours a week on a particular space, or that's externally, the same mix and but also what our peers are seeing. This is one of the key reasons why I've created the Chief Architect Network, because we need that opportunity to be able to learn from the outside, especially with how fast the pace of technology is changing these days. So I find that enough of us together in a room can really find the signal in the noise. And then as we activate and understand externally, what are the things that are actually providing business value that are starting to drive sort of beyond the hype value, we can
Hmm.
take that into our organizations, figure out do we have the talent internally? And if not, we find it externally and we pair it up with the different teams and departments that need to build that muscle. And we
Hmm.
create some internal competency to go deeper on how that technology might apply for us. And as we take that effort forward, we go from basically a POC or an evaluation into a pilot. And as we have a pilot, we start to see the organization creating a center of excellence around this. It starts with just a project team, that becomes a center of excellence, a center of enablement, however
Hmm.
you want to depict that, or a number of teams that kind of have that capability across the organization as they start to build this out, that are hopefully collaborating together as a looser version of that.
Yeah.
And eventually, if this is something that is going to change the company and truly get into different facets of the organization in a more widespread way, we embed that into the organization,
Yeah.
either as a dedicated function or as something that is spread across the organization and something that's a part of every group's job. And
Hmm.
ultimately, that changes how the architects engage from sort of nascent leading innovation. And I have a talk on this whole innovation pipeline that we create
Yeah.
into a focus more on engaging that group as an established domain and ensuring we have just like today, we make sure the right cloud people, the right security people are engaged.
Mhm.
In many organizations, we're making sure that we have the AI group engaged and the right people are involved in shaping both current solutions as well as future target state.
Hmm. And it's absolutely vital for that innovation not to happen in silos. And you mentioned a couple of examples around how to break down those silos and create a unified, scalable approach. And that's really important that happens across the enterprise because everybody wants to get involved in AI. It is the buzzword at the moment. So empowering people to be part of that group will certainly help the architect or practice or however, whether it's a federated model, I suppose, get that buy-in. What role should enterprise architecture play in developing responsible AI frameworks that involve legal, data, and security, Grant, from day one?
Well, we start by incubating that. I certainly
Mhm.
created that in one of my prior organizations, and getting the right folks engaged across is absolutely the first step. And then starting to identify and align with our values, what's important to us. Like, for example, the concepts of protecting our IP from AI spyware, where
Mhm.
somebody's building a knowledge graph of our knowledge workers' data without our approval or without our knowledge. But in some cases, we might actually want that, where if we can get some herd immunity from cyber attacks by sharing and gaining the value of from cybersecurity vendors, how different attacks are coming across, there's
Mhm.
value there. So we want that to be thoughtful. You look at things like ethics. How do we feel about AI and sort of we use it in our organization? Is sentiment analysis on a
Yeah.
call that's internal something we're okay with? Or could it be used in a way that's inappropriate to zoom in on how management or employees are behaving and even potentially a legal liability of you can show that maybe an environment is toxic because of how a sentiment analysis tool shows the conversation on a call. So there's a lot to consider in terms of this. Also, the haves and the have-nots. If some people
Mhm.
have this tool and others don't, is that creating a balanced workforce? So I find that it's not just the technical of is our
Mhm.
IP safe? Are the answers appropriate? And in the same way that we would ask employees to follow a code of conduct, we ask our AIs to also behave in a way that is professional. It's
Mhm.
also some components around culture and the type of environment we want to create. So it's very important you have a diverse group that are represented across the CEO's organization, generally at the skip level
Mhm.
of that leader is where you start to see that sort of governance group forming. Now, this starts and it's incubated oftentimes by enterprise architecture, but it's taken over and run as you start to build that AI foundational team. Because
Mhm.
ultimately, how this works, when I was running from an architecture desk and how it's run today from an AI desk, is very similar. You start with just sort of the high level guidance and guardrails, and then you test it. You start to see that there's a product out there that works a little differently than you might have expected, and you're not sure if it falls within the guidelines or not. So you bring this
Mhm.
back to this group who can assess it, look at the different dimensions of it against the policy, figure out if it's something we should be using or shouldn't be using, and then
Mhm.
evolve the policy to address this new type of scenario.
Yeah. Okay. And with that, we need to upskill architects, sorry, within AI, and it's fairly new from a publicity perspective. Obviously, people and businesses wanting to use it. Obviously, it's been around since the 80s as a concept and as a technology, but only really recently over the past few years. So, what are some practical ways businesses can upskill architecture teams in AI and related technologies without, I suppose, overwhelming them?
Well, there's really not like I mean, some will argue with me on this, but I
Yeah.
believe the AI training is 6 months behind in most cases because it takes a while to create and validate the curriculum. And by the time it's out there, you're training on, restorative augmented generative search
Yeah.
and as opposed to agent creation.
Yeah.
So because of the pace of innovation, traditional ways to upskill and train aren't really effective because they're just simply too far behind. So
Hmm.
we really have to solve this by getting our people hands-on with the technology and starting to use a bit of that innovation pipeline I mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
looking at and understanding what's emerging in the market, both at external events, at peer networks like the Chief Architect Network, and through what they're seeing in industry, by reading articles or watching news clips, etc. But getting informed. And then you start to map that against the strategy. I mentioned earlier the interconnected business capabilities work,
Yeah.
right? So what you're going to do is go, okay, product and service innovation was really important to me. If I double click into that within the technology dimension, does this particular tech help? We don't go the other way. We don't go, this is cool tech. How can I plug that into my strategy? We stick with the strategy and go, what have I learned that might help in this area, or that area? And now I have a bit of an idea of what I might try. And this is where you're going to do a proof of concept. Now, the
Hmm.
proof of concept is a place where you're still kind of exploring. And when you get into pilot and you're using it for real, you hit the
Hmm.
trough of disillusionment. This is when you start to see if the tech actually works. And it's also where you start to really get your battle stripes and
Yeah.
learn enough about it to start to get skilled in the area. And generally, you're also not doing this alone.
Yeah.
As a common theme in architecture, you'll be still continuing to stay at the high level, being looking at the next level of innovation and staying tuned into what's happening at the same time is keeping your pulse on these pilots, POCs, and initial production deployments to see what's working and what's not with people that are spending 40 hours a week on that particular topic. If
Yeah.
we make the mistake of not getting others engaged to do the depth, we end up doing what I call sawtooth architecture. We start up here and then we
Yeah.
dive into some very detailed, nuanced thing, and we lose sight of what's happening at the top of the market. And only when we come back up for air do we get that next refresh signal. We really
Hmm.
can't afford to lose the signal. So I
Yeah.
think it's incredibly important that we have someone with us in the journey that's going to take that deeper as a technical architect into a technical lead, into a subject matter expert or developer that can actually drive out that full test and learn scenario. We get our
Hmm.
hands dirty, but there has to be others involved for us to play the role of an enterprise architect.
And do you believe enterprise architecture is currently keeping pace with the rate of innovation coming from hyperscalers and vendors? Yeah.
Could you say that one more time, Mario?
Yeah, yeah. Do you believe EA is currently keeping pace with the rate of innovation coming from vendors and hyperscalers and whatnot?
I don't think anybody is.
Yeah.
Like that's the reality is that even the hyperscalers themselves, their sales team is usually a few months behind their product R&D team, and this is evolving so quickly that no one can say they're fully up to speed on everything. That's why
Hmm.
it's so important to be focused in on the capabilities that you're trying to enable for your organization and to specialize in the things that are going to drive value and outcomes based on what your peers are seeing in industry and
Hmm.
based on what you're learning about in those emerging and critical focus areas in your capability map.
Hmm.
So I don't try to boil the ocean.
Yeah.
Just make sure that your shores are well understood, protected,
Hmm.
and enhanced.
Okay, fair enough. So just to round off that sort of tech innovation piece. So if you're in an environment where teams are experimenting with AI in silos outside of a cohesive strategy, or if you're struggling to keep up with the speed of innovation from vendors or hyperscalers, or if it's difficult, if you're having difficulty designing scalable, compliant AI architectures, especially with data residency and model governance, then things that you can do, which we've discussed, creating a structured innovation radar to track, test, and triage emerging tech, partnering with data science, security, and legal early on to build responsible AI frameworks, absolutely imperative. And then upskilling the architecture team with AI literacy. Even non-coders need to understand the fundamentals of LLMs, MLOps, and prompt engineering. From a sales perspective, I'm using AI pretty much every single day. So people within your organization that sit outside of tech will be doing it as well. So it's really important that they get the training and they're not just going off in their own silos. So moving on to talent shortages and skills gaps. So EA isn't just, an enterprise architect. So it isn't just a technologist. They're a translator, a strategist, a change leader, and to some extent, a salesperson as well. But the supply of professionals who can operate in that intersection of deep technical knowledge and business fluency is painfully limited. As somebody who speaks to 50 to 100 every single week, I know that it is limited. So it's not just about Java or TOGAF anymore. The ideal enterprise architect now has to understand cloud native platforms, data mesh, real-time streaming, security by design. I think Grant's coined a phrase of the W-shape architect, which we'll come back to in a second. AI ethics, how to speak the language of CFOs and CMOs. So, Grant, why is the modern enterprise architect so hard to find, and what makes this role uniquely difficult to fill today? And I'm not just saying with anyone, they have to be good, right? And that's the difficulty. There's plenty of enterprise architects on the market. It's finding the good ones. So why is that so hard to find?
Well, it's an interesting question, why? And I think that it's really about how architects have grown up.
Hmm.
Architects have mostly grown up. There's two paths, right? There's the path of growing up as a deep technologist, and you get into architecture because you were the most technical, the deepest, and the broad, and the most capable in your particular team. And then you start to understand how your team connects to other teams, and that's when you move from a technical lead into a technical architect. And as that top of your kind of span continues to grow from connecting domains to interconnected domains across an enterprise, that's when you start to build an enterprise architecture focus. But given that what got you here was depth, that keeps you there. That doesn't actually enable you to grow further into those broader connections. And I think that's where we have to start to develop a different skill set, which is really around enterprise thinking, which many of us create an enterprise architecture, but then being able to articulate it in the frame of the business is
Hmm.
coming at us from an entirely different angle. So I
Yeah.
think that's what makes it so rare is that somebody who is able to grow up in those technical ranks can pivot once they reach that enterprise scale viewpoint into
Hmm.
making it make sense for stakeholders they may not have had to speak to
Yeah.
outside a very specific silo or segment of their business until they reach that enterprise place. Now, the other place that enterprise architects can come in is from a place of a business or strategy or business analyst type of a role where they're looking at the business holistically or a problem holistically and starting to understand what is the underlying technology that will enable that. And
Hmm.
those folks can generally move from a business analyst to an enterprise business analyst into a business architect. And the
Yeah.
business architect has the exact opposite challenge. They see wide, they understand the concept of how technology applies, but do they have enough depth to know what they're talking about when they go a click or two deeper? So both of these roles struggle to complete the end of their picture. And the
Hmm.
ultimate that we're trying to create is, as you mentioned, a W-shaped viewpoint, which isn't just a T, which is
Hmm.
extreme depth in one area and a broad top. You want to start to build the W, which is gradual depth into one area, connecting to another area with gradual depth in that area. And I like to
Mhm.
call it the WWW shaped architect, right? Where it's all you get as
Yeah.
much as you can, and that continues into creating somebody that really has enough knowledge to cross many different gaps and enough to know when there's a sanity check needed of does this actually make sense or does it
Mhm.
just sound good? And that's what I think makes it so rare is you have to connect those two different entry points and really be proficient in both that business side and that business problem understanding and business articulation and technical depth.
Yeah, and it's really hard to do that because, as you say, naturally, where people come from is either going to be that business side or that technology side, and you kind of want both. How can businesses build that internal talent pipeline to grow architecture capability, so they don't have to rely on consultants? Because consultancies are doing quite well from going in there and providing that high level enterprise piece.
Consultants aren't the enemy.
No.
I think take the talent any and everywhere you need to rent or buy. And I think that you can develop that architecture skill set by providing opportunities that gradually expose people into something that they haven't done before with a
Mhm.
little bit more scope. But you
Yep.
don't want the blast radius to exceed what that person could manage if they weren't successful.
Yep.
So you want a high probability of success, or at least a medium probability of success, and a acceptable risk radius of if it doesn't go well, that we don't hurt that person's career.
Mhm.
So where they don't have the skills necessary, a consultant can help come in and provide a little bit of coaching, a little bit of mentorship, and a little bit of professional learning for that individual to develop that capability. That
Mhm.
applies to technology. It also applies to architecture and any other skill set you might want to create in your organization. So I find that oftentimes also the business wants the credibility of an external organization to help them
Mm.
on a major transformation or pivot, often
Yeah.
coming in at the board level or the C level. These are fantastic partners for architecture
Mhm.
because they've got the understanding of the external viewpoint that maybe your architecture may have or might not have
Mhm.
internally, and your architects understand how the entire organization is stood up, where
Mhm.
the different people are that have the skills needed, and that can create a great partnership to help that C-level initiative that brought in this consultancy actually
Mhm.
deliver on that besides just staying in PowerPoint because we
Yeah.
can connect the depth of the organization into that strategy. We just have to make sure that we respect each other's role in that journey and that we're
Mhm.
supporting one another and not creating internal competition that actually works against what the organization needs.
Of course. Absolutely. And if that C-level initiative, they've paid whatever amount of money for external consultants, they're more likely to get buy-in because they paid and it's been a cost, so they want to see a return on investment. A little bit harder.
Exactly. It's a wonderful chance to champion the enterprise architecture
Yeah.
teams noticing of what might be needed.
Yeah.
Hey, we needed an investment here, and this is just the opportunity. Now we have a chance to actually activate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one way businesses can upskill architects by bringing in external consultants and helping them. Have you got any other examples of ways that organizations can I suppose, rethink upskilling?
Well, I found that I like to take architects that come into, and I've actually got a bit of a playbook on this on my LinkedIn. It's what is a chief architect and how do I become one? And it
Hmm.
really talks about how once you have kind of graduated from the enterprise business analyst to a business architect, or you've moved from a technical architect into an enterprise architect, you don't want to just stay in one spot. So I found that having the people that are kind of my direct reports in the enterprise architecture function benefit from moving around, getting a pivoting assignment. If they started in the customer side of the equation, what does the supply chain side look like? And can they take a pivot in that space?
Hmm.
Again, you wanna make sure that you're supporting what the organization needs. You can't if one area of the company is going through a major transformation and is critical for the company's success, maybe not the best place to put someone with a development opportunity that's significant.
Yeah.
But just in general, I think we can teach a lot of enterprise thinking by creating enterprise opportunity to move across.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's how you can build a successor. within a chief architect's team is the person that's done enough of the areas of the organization with hands-on experience might be ready for your job over time. And
Mhm.
ultimately, that's our job, is to
Yeah.
create a succession that can ultimately replace us someday.
The next generation. And I suppose people often hear enterprise and they think it's sort of top level or one level below the C suite, where actually to understand the business at a more granular level, you probably need to experience it at in the different departments. I once worked with an organization that used to do a 2 year architecture, almost like an apprenticeship, really. They were graduates and, they'd gone to college or university, but they specifically put them for 6 months in different areas of the business so they can really understand those different areas. So, and it's great breeding ground, I suppose. What role can AI play in the hiring process for architects, and how do you ensure it helps rather than hinders?
Well, I think AI is playing a role in a lot of the different areas that we work, but one of the things we have to be careful of as it relates to hiring decisions is many of us have a human in the loop requirement for things that are people impacting decisions. So we have to go there first. We also know there's a lot of bias embedded into the architecture of AI, and it's something that you actually expect. Anything that's making a decision has a bias, but is that bias aligned to our values, et cetera? So I think that kind of you have to start with your guardrails around what you want to allow your AI to do and what you do not. And then it's like any other hiring function. There's some word matching analysis that LLMs are great at. And there's other components of things that can help. But I have to be honest, in today's world, the idea that I can just polish up a pretty resume, hit the submit button on an open job, and I will be considered among all of the other applicants. And if my resume is best, I will get the job is a fantasy. That might have
Hmm.
been the case, a couple decades ago, but it's no longer the reality. To be able to obtain a job and to be able to find the right talent, we need to be building relationships in the marketplace.
Yeah.
And that applies to hiring individuals as well as it applies to those seeking to be hired. Ultimately, that's what gets you into the process, not an AI review of a resume,
Yeah.
not anything else. And then the resume is what like doesn't get you kicked out, right? If you have a resume that makes no sense and you're in your interview processes and one of the peer interviewers looks at the resume and goes, "Why are they even in this process?" That's where your resume plays a role. But generally, we need to talk, not type, as my friend Nick, who's an executive coach, shares. We need to be out there shaking hands. And I don't think an AI is going to help you with that, at least not with today's AI technology. But it certainly can help if you are going to the resume stack and you're looking for people who use the right word the right number of times. However, I think that's absolutely the wrong way to hire.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Networking is the best way. And, when you're meeting people time and time again, so not just once, not just twice, it's coffees, it's beers, or whatever it may be, over 10, 15 times over the course of a couple of years, you've got your little cupboard of architects that you can open up and tap into. But also, if they're doing it right, they've got a cupboard of chief architects that they can tap into when I know they've been laid off or they fancy a new challenge or
Bingo.
whatever. But because you've met 10 to 20 times, you get on, you share the same values, you've had the same challenges and you've overcome them in similar ways and so on and so forth. So definitely the way to do it. And as you say, not anytime soon is AI going to change that or hinder it, I suppose. So as we
Truthfully,
finish
that's
up,
one of the things I love about the Chief Architect Network. There's
yeah,
people in that group that can hire me, and there's lots of people in that group I can hire. And
yeah.
we kind of build those connections. I also will say that in today's job market, it's an employer's market, right? So
Mhm.
it's really it's very important that the talent that's seeking jobs are building their networks. We'll be in a moment again when it's the other way around. So we
Mhm.
always have to be doing this on both sides
Yeah.
in order to make sure that we're effective in sourcing talent. And it's when we can't, because the market is so difficult or our network doesn't reach into a particular specialization, that
Yeah.
we need to pivot and bring in some external help to help us find that talent that has a broader network. And that's
Mhm.
exactly what executive search is for.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So as we round up the final sort of topic then, Grant, if your project delays or fragile designs due to weak architectural oversight, or you're burnt out among sort of senior architects who are spread too thin, or there's an over reliance on external consultants or vendors, or AI for interviewing in the recruitment process, if you've seen any of these things, start building those talent pipelines internally through cross-functional mentorship, or putting them in different departments so they can get experience in different departments, rotating those architects into different business roles, invest in targeted upskilling, whether that's cloud certifications or FinOps or ML or AI fundamentals. Get invested now. And then finally, obviously, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't, but as Grant just said, executive recruiters partner with the right ones that understand the nuances of hiring architecture athletes, not just checkbox CVs. So we're coming towards the end of the live show. It doesn't look like we've got many or any questions, sorry, but if anybody wants to start typing away, now's the chance just before we finish up. But I'd say that was definitely a masterclass in clarity, impact, and a bit of future proofing too, Grant. So thank you so much for that. If there's one thing I hope you do take away today, it's this: enterprise architecture is not just about systems, it's about strategy. It's the connective tissue between big ideas and scalable execution. So whether you're quantifying value in real business terms, or you're navigating AI with responsibility and confidence, to addressing one of the toughest hiring markets we've seen, it's clear that architecture is evolving fast, and so must the way we lead it. Huge thank you to Grant for not just sharing insights, but also pulling back the curtain on what it really takes to drive change at an architectural level. And to all those who joined us, thank you for showing up, being curious, critical, and committed to the craft. So until next time, keep asking the hard questions, keep translating complexity into clarity, and most importantly, keep building. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me, Mario.
And that's a wrap on another episode of Transformational Blueprints. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found plenty of insights and takeaways to fuel your journey. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could share it, leave a review, or give us a like. It helps us reach more people in the industry who can benefit from these conversations. Don't forget to follow Synaxia Group on LinkedIn to stay updated on new episodes. The links are in the show notes. Join us next time for more tips, strategies, and stories from some of the brightest minds in technology and transformation. Until then, take care and keep transforming.